When I stretched out my arm to join the family photo, my daughter-in-law Jennifer gently pushed my hand down and whispered, "Margaret, let's take this one with just the immediate family first." The words sliced through me like a frozen blade. Just the immediate family. My son Thomas stood there, his arm around her waist, his eyes avoiding mine as everyone else posed and smiled. I was Thomas's mother. How much more immediate could family be? The metallic taste of humiliation flooded my mouth as I stepped back, my heels clicking against the hardwood floor like a countdown to insignificance. Just the immediate family. The champagne glass trembled in my hand, sending golden ripples across the surface as I watched them gather. Thomas, Jennifer, their 2 children, Emma and Noah, and Jennifer's parents, who had flown in from Colorado for the New Year's celebration. 6 people huddled together in front of the elegantly decorated Christmas tree in my son's living room, the one I had helped them pick out and decorate just 3 weeks ago. "Perfect," Jennifer's father announced after taking the picture. "Now let's get one with everyone doing a toast." Everyone raised their glasses while I stood off to the side, invisible, nursing my untouched champagne, feeling the bubbles slowly dying in my glass, just like the joy that had filled me when I arrived at my son's house barely an hour ago. I'm 57 years old. I have raised 2 children as a single mother after my husband died when Thomas was just 12. I have worked for the same publishing house for 28 years, becoming a senior editor after 17 years of dedication and sacrifice. I have a master's degree in English literature. I maintain my home, pay my taxes, volunteer at the local literacy program, and have never missed a birthday, graduation, or school play. Yet in that moment, with 6 simple words, I was erased. Not immediate family, an appendage, an afterthought. "Mom, are you okay?" Thomas's voice pulled me back to the present moment. I blinked, realizing I'd been staring at the same spot for God knows how long. My knuckles white around the stem of my champagne flute. The room had resumed its New Year's Eve energy. Jennifer was arranging appetizers on the dining table, her mother helping, while the children played with new Christmas toys on the floor. Thomas was looking at me with that expression, the one that mixed concern with impatience, as if checking on me was an obligation rather than genuine care. "I'm fine," I said automatically, summoning a smile that felt like stretching plastic over my face. The lie tasted bitter, a familiar flavor I'd grown accustomed to over the past few years. "Just thinking about work. We have a big manuscript coming in next week." Thomas nodded, relief washing over his features as he accepted my excuse without question. "That's great, Mom, just don't work too hard, you know." He caught himself, but not before I heard the unspoken words hanging between us. "At your age, just take care of yourself," he finished awkwardly, patting my shoulder before retreating to the safety of the kitchen where Jennifer was calling him to help with something. I felt the heat of embarrassment creep up my neck as I took a sip of champagne that had long since gone flat. When had this shift happened? When had I transitioned from being an integral part of my children's lives to becoming an obligation, a burden to be managed? The champagne left a sour aftertaste as I swallowed, a perfect accompaniment to the hollowness spreading through my chest. My gaze drifted to the mantelpiece, lined with framed photographs chronicling Thomas and Jennifer's life together. Their wedding 5 years ago, their honeymoon in Hawaii, Emma's birth, Noah's christening, family vacations. I was in precisely 3 of the 15 frames, and in one of them, I was partially cropped out, just my arm visible around Emma when she was a baby. The visual evidence of my gradual erasure stood before me in silver frames, a timeline of my disappearance. "Dinner's ready." Jennifer's cheerful voice called from the dining room. "Everyone find your places." I moved toward the table, noting with a sinking feeling that the place settings had name cards, a new touch for Jennifer, who had embraced hosting duties with increasing formality over the years. My eyes scanned the elegantly written cards, finding mine at the far end of the table, next to Noah's high chair and away from the main conversation area, where Thomas, Jennifer, and her parents would be seated. The strategic placement was subtle, but unmistakable. I was positioned to help with the baby, while remaining peripheral to the adult conversation. I put you next to Noah, because he always behaves better for you, Jennifer explained when she caught me looking at the arrangement. Her voice honeyed with a justification that would make any objection on my part seem selfish or unreasonable. You have such a calming effect on him. Of course, I replied, settling into my assigned seat. My fingers instinctively straightened the silverware that was already perfectly aligned. I'm happy to help with him. Another lie, though not completely. I adored my grandson, but being relegated to unpaid babysitter during what was supposed to be a family celebration stung in ways I couldn't articulate. Jennifer's mother, Catherine, swept into the chair across from me, her recently refreshed blonde highlights catching the light from the chandelier. At 62, she was 5 years older than me, but seemed determined to maintain the appearance of someone a decade younger. The smooth tautness of her forehead betrayed regular Botox injections, while her figure remained remarkably slim in her designer dress, that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. Margaret, darling, it's been too long, Catherine said, her Denver accent stretching the vowels. How have you been? Still at the same publishing house? The question carried a subtle weight, implying stagnation rather than stability. Yes, 28 years now, I replied, helping Noah with his bib. I'm leading the new fiction division launch this spring. Oh, how nice for you, Catherine nodded, her attention already drifting toward her husband's conversation with Thomas about golf memberships. It's wonderful to have something to keep you busy, something to keep you busy. As if my career was a hobby, a distraction from an otherwise empty life. I bit the inside of my cheek, focusing on cutting Noah's food into tiny, manageable pieces, while the conversation flowed around me like water around a stone. Jennifer was describing their plans to renovate the kitchen in the spring, while her father offered unsolicited financial advice to Thomas about investment opportunities. The normal chatter of family life that somehow excluded me, even as I sat at the same table. Dinner progressed with me, mainly speaking to Noah, wiping his face and helping him with his sippy cup. Occasionally someone would include me with a question about work or how my holiday had been. But each conversation thread quickly returned to subjects that centered around Thomas and Jennifer's life, their jobs, their home, their children, their future plans. We're thinking of joining the Oak Ridge Country Club, Jennifer announced as she served the dessert, an elaborate tiramisu she had spent hours preparing according to a recipe she'd found in a gourmet magazine. The initiation fee is steep, but the networking opportunities for Thomas are invaluable. That's where the Hendersons belong, right? Catherine asked, referring to family friends I'd never met. They love it there. It's $45,000 for the initiation, Thomas explained. But with the kind of clients I could meet there, it would pay for itself within a year. I nearly choked on my water. $45,000 for a country club membership, when Thomas had called me just 3 months ago, asking if I could help with Emma's preschool tuition, because they were a little tight this month. I had transferred $4,800 to their account the next day, without hesitation, drawing from my retirement savings. The memory made my cheeks burn. What do you think, Mom? Thomas asked suddenly, pulling me from my thoughts. All eyes turned to me, and I realized this was one of those moments where my response would be judged not for its content but for its support. If it makes sense for your career, it sounds like a good opportunity. I offered neutrally, unable to voice my true concerns about their financial priorities. The tension in my son's shoulders eased at my apparent approval, and the conversation moved on. I took a bite of tiramisu that I couldn't taste, the sweetness lost in the bitterness of my thoughts. As dinner concluded and we moved back to the living room to await midnight, my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from my daughter, Rachel, who lived in Seattle with her wife. Happy New Year, Mom. Sorry we couldn't make it this year. How's the dinner at Thomas's? Surviving Jennifer and her parents. A small smile touched my lips. Rachel had always seen through Jennifer's polite veneer to the subtle digs beneath. I started typing a response. grateful for the momentary escape. Margaret, would you mind not being on your phone? We were thinking of playing a game before midnight. Jennifer called from across the room, her tone suggesting she was addressing a teenager rather than a professional woman with decades of life experience. Sorry, I murmured, quickly finishing my text with all fine. Call you tomorrow, love you. And putting my phone away. The chastisement hung in the air, another small humiliation in an evening filled with them. No one else had been asked to put their devices away. Thomas was still checking his work email, and Jennifer's father was scrolling through something on his tablet. The game turned out to be Trivial Pursuit, with teams divided by couples, Thomas and Jennifer, Catherine and Robert, and me partnered with 9-year-old Emma since we were both extras. The categorization stung, but Emma's excitement at being my partner soothed the hurt somewhat. She curled next to me on the sofa, her small body warm against mine as we contemplated our first question. Literature for $500. Jennifer read from the card. Name the author who wrote The Old Man and the Sea. Hemingway. Emma and I answered simultaneously, sharing a high five. My granddaughter grinned up at me. Grandma knows all the book ones, she declared proudly. She reads even more than Daddy. That's because Grandma doesn't have as many responsibilities, Jennifer commented with a tight smile. When you have a family to take care of, reading becomes a luxury. The room fell awkwardly silent for a moment. Even Thomas looked uncomfortable at the implication that I had somehow had an easier life by virtue of being older and now living alone. Actually, I said carefully, measuring my words. I read most classics, while raising Thomas and Rachel on my own after their father died. Reading was how I stayed sane during those years. The memory of endless nights sitting up with paperbacks after the children were finally asleep, stealing moments of escape between loads of laundry and checking homework, tightened my throat. Of course, Jennifer backpedaled, recognizing she'd overstepped. I didn't mean, it's just different now, with both parents working corporate jobs. Mom was working full-time at the publishing house and raising us, Thomas said quietly, a rare moment of defense that both surprised and moved me. She used to edit manuscripts after we went to bed. Jennifer's smile stiffened further, and she quickly moved on to the next question. I caught Catherine giving her daughter a warning glance, the kind that communicated not now without words. I wondered what conversations they had when I wasn't around. What complaints Jennifer shared about her aging mother-in-law who didn't know her place. The game continued with underlying tension, Emma oblivious as she celebrated our correct answers. We were actually winning when the clock struck 11:30 p.m., and Jennifer declared it was time to prepare for the midnight toast. Let's all write down our resolutions for the new year, she suggested, distributing elegant note cards and pens. We can share them before the ball drops. I stared at the blank card, pen poised. What were my resolutions? To not be slowly erased from my son's life. To maintain dignity in the face of constant subtle dismissals. To resist becoming the stereotype of the needy, clingy mother-in-law that I suspected Jennifer already believed me to be. I wrote down safe platitudes instead. Read more classics. Take that cooking class. Visit Rachel in Seattle twice this year. Acceptable, non-threatening ambitions that wouldn't rock any boats. At 5 minutes to midnight, we gathered in front of the television to watch the ball drop in Times Square. Jennifer bustled about with fresh champagne flutes, and Thomas turned the volume up as the countdown began in New York. The excitement was building. Emma and Noah allowed to stay up for the special occasion, their faces glowing with anticipation. Everyone ready with their glasses. Thomas called, distributing the champagne and sparkling cider for the children. We formed a loose circle, and I found myself once again positioned slightly outside the main group, as if my proximity might somehow contaminate their perfect family tableau. Let's get a picture, Jennifer's father suggested as the 60-second countdown began. Everyone get together. And just like that, I was shuffled further back, outside the frame, as the two nuclear families positioned themselves for the photo. Margaret, would you mind taking it? Robert asked, holding out his phone. That way we can all be in it, except me. I took the phone with numb fingers as the family grouped together, their faces flushed with celebration and belonging. I held up the device, seeing them framed in the screen, 3 generations, minus one, the one who had given birth to Thomas, who had raised him through childhood illnesses and adolescent heartbreaks, who had worked overtime to pay for his college applications. That one, me, was behind the camera, documenting a moment I was excluded from. 10, 9, 8. The television announcer began, echoed by my family. I took the picture, then another and a third, just to be sure. 7, 6, 5. Got it, I said, returning the phone as the countdown continued. I retrieved my champagne glass from where I'd set it down, rejoining the circle but feeling the physical and emotional distance more acutely than ever. For 3, 2, 1, Happy New Year. Cheers erupted, glasses clinked, hugs exchanged. I received quick, perfunctory embraces, Jennifer's lasting barely a second, Thomas's distracted as he looked over my shoulder at the television. The children already running back to their toys now that the exciting moment had passed. Happy New Year, Margaret, Catherine said, air kissing near my cheek. Here's to a wonderful 2026 for all of us. Happy New Year, I echoed, taking a sip of champagne that tasted like nothing at all. In that moment, watching my son's family celebrate without really including me, something crystallized in my chest, a hard, sharp certainty that things could not continue this way. The realization burned like ice in my veins, both painful and clarifying. I would not spend another year being gradually erased, being treated as an accessory rather than a person with value beyond my usefulness to others. I would not accept being cropped out of my own life story. As the celebration continued around me, I made a silent resolution that wasn't written on any note card. This would be the year I reclaimed my visibility. This would be the year I refused to disappear. Little did I know then, standing in my son's living room, with a forced smile and cooling champagne, just how radically that resolution would transform my life in the months to come, or that the journey would begin with a seemingly innocent invitation just 3 days later that would change everything. 3 days after the New Year's celebration, I sat at my desk at Meridian Publishing, staring at the email that had just appeared in my inbox. The subject line read, Senior Staff Restructuring, Confidential, and it was from Miles Harrington, the new CEO who had taken over 6 months ago when our publishing house was acquired by Centaur Media Group. My fingers hovered over the trackpad, reluctant to click open what my instincts told me would not be good news. The office around me hummed with the usual post-holiday energy, colleagues chatting about their breaks, the clacking of keyboards, the whir of the espresso machine someone had gifted the break room for Christmas. For 28 years, this place had been my sanctuary. Even during the hardest times after David died, leaving me with 2 young children and a mortgage, coming to work had given me purpose and stability. I had started as an editorial assistant and worked my way up methodically, surviving 3 ownership changes, countless industry disruptions, and the shift to digital publishing that had sent many of my colleagues into early retirement. Now, as senior acquisitions editor for literary fiction, I managed a team of 5 and had built a respectable list of authors, including 2 National Book Award finalists in the past decade. With a deep breath, I clicked on the email, my stomach clenching as I skimmed the corporate jargon. Strategic realignment, maximizing efficiency, fresh perspectives, transitional period, ... double quotes. The essential message, buried beneath paragraphs of euphemisms, was that Centaur was streamlining the editorial department. Senior editors like myself were being offered either early retirement packages or creative consultant positions. A demotion that would mean half the salary and none of the decision-making authority I'd earned over nearly 3 decades. A mandatory meeting was scheduled for 11 a.m. to discuss these exciting changes with the executive team. I checked my watch just over an hour to process this bombshell before I'd need to appear professional and composed in front of management and my team. The office suddenly felt too warm, the collar of my blouse too tight against my neck. I closed the email and stood up, needing air, water, space to think. In the restroom, I splashed cold water on my face, careful not to smudge my makeup, and stared at my reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at me had silver threads running through her chestnut hair. I'd stopped coloring it 3 years ago, tired of the chemical smell and tedious upkeep. Fine lines framed my eyes and bracketed my mouth, mapping decades of expressions, concentration, laughter, worry over sick children, late nights with manuscripts. My colleagues often commented that I looked good for my age, a compliment with a built-in qualification. That always made me wonder what exactly a 57-year-old woman was supposed to look like. "Are you okay, Margaret?" The voice startled me. Diane from marketing stood in the doorway, concern evident in her expression. At 34, she represented the younger generation that was increasingly populating the company's leadership roles. "Just feeling a bit under the weather," I lied, forcing a smile. "Nothing serious." "I heard about the meeting," Diane said quietly, stepping further into the restroom and checking that we were alone. "Miles has been in closed-door sessions with the Centaur execs all week. The rumor is they're making major cuts to bring in their own people." I got the email, I admitted, my voice steadier than I felt, early retirement or demotion. Essentially, Diane's expression shifted to something like pity, which was somehow worse than the news itself. "That's awful, Margaret. Everyone knows your authors are some of our most reliable performers." She hesitated, then added, "But you know how these corporate types are always chasing the next trend, looking for younger voices who understand the digital landscape or whatever buzzword they're fixated on this month." Younger voices, the words echoed unpleasantly, reminding me of Jennifer's dismissal just days before. Just the immediate family. Different contexts, same message. "You're no longer central, no longer essential. Thanks for the heads up," I said, straightening my shoulders and reclaiming my professional demeanor. I'd better prepare for the meeting. Back at my desk, I closed the door, a privilege of seniority, and pulled up the sales figures for my department's titles over the past 5 years. The data told a clear story. Consistent growth, even during industry downturns, with particularly strong performance in our new digital audio division that I had championed despite initial resistance from the previous management. I compiled the numbers into a concise document, then opened my personnel file and added my performance reviews, all exemplary. By the time the conference room began filling for the 11 a.m. meeting, I had armed myself with data and determination. I took a seat near the middle of the table, not confrontationally close to the executives, but not relegated to the edges either. Miles Harrington entered last, flanked by 2 consultants from Centaur, whom I recognized from previous corporate visits. The CEO was 42 according to his LinkedIn profile that I'd studied when he was appointed young for his position. With the confident stride of someone who had advanced quickly in his career. "Thank you all for joining us today," Miles began, his voice carrying the slight southern accent that he'd mostly suppressed but emerged when he was presenting 2 groups. "As you know, Centaur Media's acquisition of Meridian presents exciting opportunities for growth and innovation." What followed was 20 minutes of corporate speak that essentially confirmed what the email had outlined. Editorial was being restructured to focus on high-growth categories and digital-first initiatives. Senior staff were being offered transition packages that honored their valuable contributions, while allowing the company to pivot toward future markets. When the floor opened for questions, several hands shot up, but Miles pointed to me first. "Margaret, you've been with Meridian longer than anyone in this room. I'm sure you have insights to share." The room's attention turned to me, and I felt a familiar sensation, the slight dismissal in his tone, the expectation that I would express concerns that could be gently, but firmly set aside as resistance to necessary change. I had heard that tone from my son, from Jennifer, from doctors who assumed my age made me technologically inept or resistant to new ideas. "Thank you, Miles," I said, opening the folder containing my prepared materials. I do have some thoughts to share, particularly regarding the performance metrics that should be guiding these decisions. Without waiting for permission, I stood and distributed copies of my analysis to everyone at the table. As you'll see, the literary fiction division has outperformed market benchmarks by 23% over the past 5 years, with digital audio growth at 47% annually since we launched the initiative 3 years ago. Miles looked momentarily thrown by my preparedness, glancing at the Centaur consultants who were frowning at the unexpected data. These are impressive figures, Margaret, Miles acknowledged cautiously. But our restructuring is based on projections for future markets, not just past performance. I understand completely, I replied, maintaining eye contact. That's why page 3 shows our division's strategic roadmap for emerging formats and audience development, including the Gen Z Reader initiative that increased our under 25 demographic by 31% last quarter. A murmur ran through the room. Many of my colleagues hadn't been aware of these numbers. I had deliberately kept our success quiet until I could secure additional budget before sharing the results widely. For the next 10 minutes, I presented a case for the value of experienced editorial leadership in navigating market changes, pointing out specific instances where institutional knowledge had saved the company from costly mistakes during previous transitions. I was careful to acknowledge the need for fresh perspectives but emphasized that wholesale replacement of senior staff would result in the loss of critical relationships with agents, authors, and industry partners. When I finished, the room was silent. Miles was looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, surprise, mingled with something else. Respect, annoyance. The Centaur consultants were whispering to each other, recalculating whatever metrics they had used to justify their recommendations. Thank you for this thorough analysis, Margaret, Miles finally said. We'll certainly take these factors into consideration as we finalize the restructuring plans. The meeting continued with other questions, but I could feel the shift in energy. Several younger colleagues who had initially seemed resigned to the changes were now looking at the executives with more critical eyes, seeing the gaps in their planning. By the end of the hour, Miles announced that they would revisit certain aspects of the transition strategy before making final decisions. As people filed out of the conference room, Diane caught up with me. That was incredible, she whispered. I've never seen anyone stand up to Miles like that, with actual data instead of just complaints. I've been around long enough to know that numbers speak louder than emotions in these situations, I replied, gathering my materials. The temporary victory felt hollow, though I had no illusions that I had saved my position, merely postponed the inevitable, and perhaps improved the terms of my eventual exit. Back at my desk, I received a calendar invite for a one-on-one meeting with Miles scheduled for 4 p.m. The subject line simply read, follow-up discussion. So this was it, the private conversation where he would gently but firmly explain why, despite my impressive performance, the company needed to move in a direction that didn't include me in a senior role. I spent the afternoon tying up loose ends, sending emails to authors I was concerned might be neglected in the transition, and quietly backing up personal files from my computer. If today was to be my last day in a role that had defined so much of my adult life, I wanted to leave knowing I had done everything possible for the books and writers I had championed. At 3:55 p.m., I gathered my notebook and pen and walked to Miles's corner office, keeping my head high as I passed colleagues who offered sympathetic smiles. His assistant, a recent college graduate named Zoe, gave me a nervous nod as she announced my arrival through the intercom. Miles's office was minimalist and modern, a stark contrast to the previous CEO's traditional wood-paneled space filled with first editions and publishing memorabilia. He gestured for me to take a seat across from his glass desk while he finished typing something on his laptop. Margaret, he finally said, closing his computer and giving me his full attention. That was quite a presentation earlier. Thank you, I replied neutrally, waiting for the other shoe to drop. I've been reviewing your personnel file and your department's performance more thoroughly since our meeting. He leaned back in his chair, studying me with a calculating gaze. You've consistently been rated as one of our most effective managers, and your editorial instincts have resulted in some of Meridian's most prestigious acquisitions. I remained silent, knowing this was the preamble to the however that would explain my obsolescence. What I'm curious about, Miles continued, is why someone with your track record hasn't pursued higher positions within the company. You were nominated for the executive editor role twice according to your file, but withdrew your candidacy both times. The question caught me off guard. I had expected a dismissal, not an inquiry into my career choices. The first time was when my husband died, I explained, surprised by the slight tremor in my voice. I had 2 young children and couldn't take on additional responsibilities while being a single parent. The second time was when Thomas, my son, was having difficulties in high school. I needed flexibility that an executive position wouldn't allow. Miles nodded, making a note on a pad beside him. And now, your children are grown. What would prevent you from considering a more senior role? The conversation had veered so far from what I'd anticipated that I struggled to process his question. Are you offering me a promotion rather than early retirement? A smile flickered across his face. I'm exploring options. The Centaur team made recommendations based on an organizational chart, not on performance metrics or institutional knowledge. Your presentation today made me realize we may be overlooking valuable assets in our rush to modernize. Hope and suspicion warred within me. Was this genuine, or a more sophisticated way to ease me out? What exactly are you proposing? I need someone to lead our legacy authors division, the established names that provide our steady revenue stream, while we develop newer voices. It would be an executive editor position, reporting directly to me, with oversight of backlist digitization and special editions as well. Legacy authors, the title itself suggested. Retirement pasture, established writers who were no longer cutting edge but still reliably profitable. A way to move me sideways rather than up or out. I thought of the family photo at New Year's, just the immediate family, and felt a similar strategy at work here. Keep Margaret involved, but not at the center. That sounds like a way to separate me from the acquisition of new voices, I observed, keeping my tone professional despite the sinking feeling in my chest, essentially removing me from the current literary conversation. Miles had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. It would utilize your experience with our established authors while allowing younger editors to develop relationships with emerging writers who might better connect with their sensibilities. There it was, the assumption that at 57, I couldn't possibly understand or connect with younger perspectives. Never mind that I had launched the company's most successful young adult imprint 5 years ago, or that my assistant editors regularly praised my openness to experimental forms and digital innovations. I see, I said, gathering my thoughts. And if I were to decline this opportunity, then the early retirement package would be your other option, as outlined in the email. His tone remained pleasant, but the message was clear. Take the sidelining or leave altogether. As we discussed the details of both options, I maintained my composure, asking appropriate questions about the transition timeline, team structure, and compensation adjustments. Miles seemed relieved by my professionalism, probably having expected tears or anger from the older woman being gently pushed aside. I promised to give him my decision by the end of the week, and stood to leave, my legs surprisingly steady despite the emotional earthquake I felt inside. Margaret, Miles said as I reached the door, causing me to turn back. For what it's worth, I was impressed by your presentation today. Not many people in your position would have come so prepared. In my position, the phrase echoed Jennifer's comment about reading being a luxury when you have responsibilities. Always these qualifications, these reminders that I was being judged by a different standard, viewed through the lens of assumptions about my age and relevance. Thank you, Miles, I replied with a small smile that didn't reach my eyes. I've found that preparation is essential when you're constantly being underestimated. I closed his office door behind me before he could respond, walking through the open office area with my chin up and expression neutral. Aware of curious glances from colleagues wondering about my fate. Only when I reached my car in the parking garage did I allow my hands to shake, gripping the steering wheel as the full impact of the day washed over me. First my family, now my career. The two pillars of identity I had built my life around were simultaneously pushing me to the margins. The legacy. Author's division. Just the immediate family. Different words, same message. You are no longer central. You are past your prime. You are valued for what you've contributed, not for what you might still create. As I started my car, my phone buzzed with a text from Rachel. How was work today? Did you survive the corporate vultures? My daughter's intuitive timing almost made me laugh. She had always had a sixth sense for when I was struggling. Instead of responding immediately, I pulled out of the parking space and headed not toward my home but to the coffee shop 3 blocks away. I needed neutral territory to think, to plan, to decide who Margaret Sullivan was going to be now that the roles that had defined her for decades were being rewritten without her consent. The sky had darkened to deep twilight, the January cold settling over the city as I parked outside Café Lumière, a local independent spot that had somehow survived the onslaught of chains. Inside, the warm lighting and scent of fresh coffee created a cocoon of comfort as I ordered a cappuccino and found a corner table partially hidden by a bookshelf. As I sat there, watching the steam rise from my cup, I realized that I was facing a crossroads, one that would determine not just my professional future but how I would define myself in this new chapter of my life. Would I accept the legacy author's role and the gradual fade into irrelevance it represented? Would I take the retirement package and find myself with time but without the purpose that had anchored me for so long? Or was there another path, one I couldn't yet see clearly, but that might lead to something unexpected? Little did I know that the answer would arrive in the most unlikely form, from a woman sitting alone at the next table, typing furiously on her laptop, who would glance over at me in just a few moments and change the trajectory of my story completely. The woman at the next table glanced up from her laptop, our eyes meeting briefly. Before she returned to her typing, she was perhaps in her early 60s, with a stylish silver bob and striking red glasses that complemented her confident posture. Something about her seemed familiar, though I couldn't place where I might have seen her before. I sipped my cappuccino, trying not to dwell on the hollow feeling expanding in my chest as I contemplated my options for the future. "Excuse me," the woman said suddenly, startling me from my thoughts. "Are you Margaret Sullivan, from Meridian Publishing?" I blinked in surprise, studying her face more carefully. "Yes, I am. I'm sorry, have we met?" She smiled, revealing a slight gap between her front teeth that gave her an unexpected youthfulness. "Not formally. I'm Eleanor Vance. I attended your panel at the Literary Futures Conference in Chicago last year. Your insights on digital adaptations of classic works were brilliant." "Thank you," I replied, genuinely touched by the recognition. That feels like a lifetime ago now. The panel had been one of my proudest professional moments, standing room only, with engaged questions that had sparked a lively debate among industry leaders. Eleanor closed her laptop and gestured to the empty chair across from me. "May I join you? Unless you'd prefer to be alone." I hesitated only briefly before nodding. Company might be preferable to spiraling further into my thoughts. "Please do." As Eleanor gathered her things and moved to my table, I noticed how deliberately she moved. Not with the hesitancy often attributed to age, but with a measured grace that suggested she valued each movement. She wore a beautifully tailored charcoal blazer over a simple black top, accented with a statement necklace of twisted silver that looked handcrafted. "I hope I'm not interrupting a creative moment," she said as she settled into the chair. "You had that editor's look of deep contemplation." I smiled wryly. "Less creative and more existential, I'm afraid. It's been a challenging day." She nodded knowingly. "Those seem to multiply after 50, don't they? Though I've found they often lead to the most interesting redirections." There was something so direct and unapologetic about her. manner that I found myself responding with unexpected honesty. Redirections would be one way to put it. My publishing house is essentially pushing me toward early retirement or a glorified demotion to their legacy authors division. Eleanor's expression darkened. Legacy authors? How convenient to package age discrimination in such a respectable-sounding title. She took a sip of her tea before adding, "Unfortunately, it's a familiar story. I spent 34 years in academic publishing before facing a similar redirection 4 years ago." "What did you do?" I asked, suddenly eager to know if there was a path through this wilderness I hadn't considered. A slow smile spread across her face. "I told them to keep their gold watch and redirected myself instead, which is how Second Chapter Press was born." She reached into her bag and handed me a business card printed on heavy cream stock with an elegant logo, featuring an open book transforming into a bird in flight. Eleanor Vance, founder and editorial director, Second Chapter Press, where experience creates excellence. Below was an address in the city's arts district, along with contact information and a website. "Second Chapter?" I asked, running my thumb over the embossed lettering. "A publishing house. Exclusively featuring authors over 50, Eleanor explained, a hint of pride in her voice. "We publish fiction, memoir, and narrative nonfiction by writers who have lived enough to have something substantive to say. Many were rejected by mainstream publishers who couldn't see past their birth dates to recognize their talent." I stared at her, processing the concept. "That's brilliant. How long have you been operating?" "We launched 3 years ago with just 4 titles. This year we're publishing 27 books, and our first movie adaptation starts filming in March." Her eyes sparkled with unmistakable satisfaction. "Turns out there's a substantial market for stories that don't pretend life ends at 40. The possibility represented by Eleanor's words began to penetrate the fog of disappointment that had enveloped me all day. Here was someone who had faced the same dismissal, and, instead of accepting the narrative others had written for her, had created an entirely new story. "How did you manage the startup costs?" I asked, the practical side of my brain already calculating what such a venture would require. "Publishing is notoriously capital-intensive. That's where having a lifetime of industry connections proved invaluable," Eleanor replied. "I found 5 investors who understood the vision. All women over 55 who had capital and wanted to support something meaningful. We started small, focusing on quality over quantity, and built gradually." She paused, studying me with increasing interest. "You have an acquisitions background, correct?" I nodded. "Literary fiction, primarily, though I've handled narrative nonfiction and the occasional memoir when the writing was exceptional. And I imagine you've maintained relationships with agents and authors throughout your career." "Of course. The industry runs on relationships." I thought of the dozens of agents who still sent me their most literary works first, the authors whose careers I had nurtured from debut novels to established backlists. Eleanor leaned forward slightly. "Margaret, I didn't just happen to recognize you today. I've been following your career for years. Your acquisition of Lydia Montgomery's debut, when everyone else rejected it. Your championing of Theodore Green's experimental novel, that went on to win the National Book Award. When I saw you walk in, I almost couldn't believe my luck. The pieces suddenly connected. You've been researching me." She nodded. Unapologetic. "Second Chapter is growing faster than I anticipated. We need someone with deep experience in literary fiction acquisition to lead our expansion in that category. Someone with impeccable taste, strong agent relationships, and the editorial judgment that only comes from decades in the trenches." She paused, her gaze direct and challenging. "Someone exactly like you." My heart began to race as I understood what she was suggesting. "You're offering me a job." "I'm proposing a conversation about possibilities," Eleanor corrected gently. "I don't know your situation fully, and you certainly don't know enough about Second Chapter yet to make a decision. But yes, I'm interested in discussing how someone with your specific expertise and experience might find a place with us, a place where those qualities are valued rather than seen as liabilities." The synchronicity was almost too perfect, this opportunity appearing precisely when I stood at a crossroads. Part of me was instantly suspicious. This seems too convenient to be coincidental. Eleanor laughed, a warm, genuine sound. I assure you, I don't typically stalk editors in coffee shops. But I do have contacts at Centaur Media, and word travels quickly when a publishing house under new management starts pushing out senior staff. I'd planned to reach out through proper channels next week, but then the universe delivered you to the table next to mine. She shrugged. I've learned not to ignore such gifts. We talked for nearly 2 hours, the cafe emptying around us as evening deepened. Eleanor outlined second chapter's mission, business model, and growth trajectory. She was refreshingly transparent about both successes and challenges, distribution limitations they were working to overcome, the careful balance between commercial viability and literary merit, the unexpected reader demographics that had emerged as their primary market. We've discovered our most passionate readers aren't necessarily older themselves, she explained. We're especially popular with educated women in their 30s and 40s who are tired of reading the same coming-of-age stories and thinly veiled relationship dramas. They want fiction with the depth and perspective that comes from authors who have witnessed the full arc of life's complications. As Eleanor spoke, I felt something stirring within me that I hadn't experienced in years, genuine excitement about publishing possibilities, not just the challenge of salvaging my career, but the thrill of building something meaningful that pushed against the cultural currents that had swept me aside. What would be my role, hypothetically? I asked, careful not to show too much eagerness, despite the hope blooming in my chest. Fiction Acquisitions Director, reporting directly to me, Eleanor replied without hesitation. You'd have significant autonomy in building your list, with input on marketing strategies and cover design. We're still small enough that everyone wears multiple hats, but large enough now to have specialized roles. The salary would likely be less than what you're making at Meridian, at least initially. But you'd have profit participation after the first year. The potential pay cut didn't concern me as much as it might have. I had been financially prudent throughout my career. My mortgage was nearly paid off, and both my children were financially independent, despite Thomas and Jennifer's occasional requests for assistance. What mattered more was purpose, respect, and the opportunity to continue meaningful work. I'd want to bring some of my authors with me, I said, testing the boundaries of this hypothetical arrangement. Eleanor nodded. Provided they fit our demographic and quality standards, absolutely. Though I should be transparent that we couldn't take everyone immediately, we're still building our capacity. As our conversation progressed, I found myself mentally calculating which of my current and former authors might be well suited to second chapter, which manuscripts in my rejected pile had shown promise, but needed more development than Meridian had been willing to invest. Which agents might have hidden gems from older writers they hadn't been able to place with mainstream publishers. By the time we finally gathered our things to leave, the coffee shop was closing around us. Eleanor handed me a USB drive. This contains our business plan, catalog, author testimonials, and financial projections. Review them at your leisure. The offer to continue this conversation stands regardless of what you decide about Meridian's proposal. We exchanged contact information and stepped out into the cold January night. Streetlights cast warm pools of light on the sidewalk as a light snow began to fall. The first of the season, delicate flakes drifting in the darkness. Thank you, I said sincerely, extending my hand. Regardless of what happens next, you've given me something invaluable. Today, a reminder that there are alternatives to the narrative I was being handed. Eleanor clasped my hand warmly. That's the most important lesson I've learned in this chapter of my life, Margaret. We don't have to accept the stories others write for us. We can create our own. She smiled, her breath visible in the cold air. I look forward to hearing which story you choose to write. As I drove home through the gently falling snow, my mind raced with possibilities. Eleanor's proposition wasn't just a potential job offer, It represented a fundamentally different way of valuing experience and maturity, rather than treating my decades in publishing as a liability. Second chapter celebrated the depth of knowledge and relationships that could only come with time. It was nearly midnight when I finally arrived home. My house was dark and quiet, a stark contrast to the buzzing energy I felt inside. I moved through the familiar rooms, turning on lamps and shedding my winter layers. In the kitchen, I poured myself a small glass of the good bourbon I kept for special occasions, then carried it to my home office, a converted sunroom at the back of the house with floor-to-ceiling, bookshelves filled with first editions and signed copies from authors I had published over the years. I sat at my desk and inserted Eleanor's USB drive into my laptop. As I began reading through the materials, author testimonials, press coverage, detailed business plans, the vision of second chapter came into sharper focus. This wasn't some vanity project or bitter response to industry ageism. It was a thoughtfully constructed business addressing a genuine market gap, led by someone with both passion and pragmatism. My phone buzzed with a text from Thomas. "Hey Mom, just checking in. Did you think more about helping with Emma's summer camp deposit? It's $2,350 and due by the 15th. Jennifer and I are a little stretched with the country club initiation this month." I stared at the message, noting how he hadn't asked about my day or how I was doing, just another financial request. Since David's death, I had always prioritized my children's needs above my own, working overtime to ensure they had opportunities and resources, saying yes when my budget whispered that I should say no. It was what mothers did, what I had done unquestioningly for decades. But as I sat there, surrounded by the physical evidence of my professional accomplishments and contemplating a potential new chapter, something shifted in my perspective. The patterns of both my personal and professional lives suddenly appeared in painful clarity. I had allowed myself to be pushed to the margins, accepting the supporting role others assigned me rather than claiming center stage in my own life. I set my phone aside without responding to Thomas's text. There would be time for that conversation tomorrow, but tonight belonged to me and the possibilities unfolding before me. I returned to Eleanor's materials, making notes and sketching ideas well past 2 in the morning, my mind more engaged than it had been in months. When I finally went to bed, I slept more soundly than I had since the New Year's Eve dinner, waking the next morning with a clarity that felt almost physical. I had decisions to make about Meridian's offer, about second chapter's possibilities, about boundaries with my family, but for the first time in longer than I could remember, I approached these choices from a position of agency rather than reaction. After showering and dressing with particular care, I called Miles Harrington's office at precisely 8:30 a.m., catching him before his day filled with meetings. "Miles, it's Margaret Sullivan. I've made my decision about the legacy author's position, and I'd like to discuss it with you in person this morning, if possible." There was a brief pause before he responded, likely surprised by my directness. "Of course, Margaret, I have a half hour free at 10, if that works for you." "Perfect. I'll see you then." I ended the call before he could ask questions, a small but satisfying assertion of control. Next, I texted Eleanor, reviewed the materials. Very impressed. Would like to continue our conversation. Available for lunch today. Her response came almost immediately. Absolutely. 1 p.m. at Riverview Bistro. They have excellent private tables for confidential discussions. I confirmed the arrangement, then turned to my closet to select an outfit appropriate for both, ending one chapter and potentially beginning another. The navy silk blouse and charcoal pantsuit I chose projected exactly the image I wanted: professional, confident, and unapologetically present. As I applied my makeup with careful precision, I studied my reflection, the same face I had examined with uncertainty yesterday, but now animated by a spark of purpose that transformed my entire appearance. The woman looking back at me seemed suddenly more vibrant, more substantial, as if she were expanding to fill space she had previously surrendered. I arrived at Meridian Publishing at 9:45, greeting colleagues with a warmth that several commented seemed different. "You look great today, Margaret," my assistant Julie remarked. "Something's changed." I smiled. "Sometimes clarity is the best cosmetic." She looked puzzled by the cryptic response, but I was already heading toward Miles's office. My stride purposeful, my decision made. The path ahead wasn't certain. Second chapter represented potential rather than guarantees, and the personal boundaries I planned to establish would inevitably create resistance. But I welcomed the controlled uncertainty. Better an unwritten chapter than accepting an ending penned by someone else's limitations. What I didn't realize, as I knocked on Miles Harrington's office door at precisely 10 a.m., was that my next conversation would not only alter my professional trajectory, but would eventually ripple outward to transform every aspect of my life, including my relationship with Thomas and Jennifer, in ways I couldn't yet imagine. "I appreciate you making time to see me, Miles." I settled into the chair across from his glass desk, setting my leather portfolio squarely in front of me. The morning sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating dust particles floating in the air between us. Miles leaned forward, fingers steepled. "Of course. Have you had a chance to consider the legacy author's position?" "I have," I replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "And I'm declining the offer." His expression registered surprise, followed quickly by resignation. "I see. Then I assume you're opting for the early retirement package. Our HR team can have the paperwork ready by—" "I'm declining that as well," I interrupted, a small thrill running through me at his momentary confusion. "I'm submitting my 2 weeks' notice, effective today." Miles blinked rapidly. "That's unexpected. May I ask why?" "The retirement package is quite generous compared to standard industry offerings. I've accepted another position," I said simply, enjoying for a brief moment the power of withholding information from someone accustomed to controlling narratives. His brow furrowed as he processed this development. "With a competitor. With a company that values experience rather than penalizing it." I removed a formal resignation letter from my portfolio and slid it across the desk. "This includes my official notice, along with a transition plan for my current projects and authors." Miles skimmed the letter, his expression shifting from confusion to something resembling grudging respect. "This is ... thorough. I didn't realize you were actively interviewing elsewhere." "Sometimes opportunities find you at precisely the right moment," I replied. The irony wasn't lost on me 24 hours ago. I had been facing professional extinction, and now I was walking away on my own terms. "Is there anything we could offer to make you reconsider?" Miles asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. I smiled slightly. "The issue isn't compensation or title, Miles. It's about working somewhere that sees my decades of experience as an asset rather than a liability." I paused, then added, "But I appreciate you asking." The meeting concluded with surprisingly little drama. Miles was nothing if not practical. Once he realized his predetermined narrative had been disrupted, he shifted quickly to damage control, discussing how we would handle the transition with my authors and team. We agreed I would personally inform my direct reports that afternoon, and Miles would announce my departure to the wider company tomorrow. As I left his office, I felt lighter than I had in months. There was uncertainty ahead, certainly, but it was uncertainty born of possibility, rather than limitation. I spent the remainder of the morning organizing files and preparing transition documents, my mind already racing with ideas for second chapter press. At 12:45, I slipped out of the office for my lunch with Eleanor, sending a quick text to Julie that I had an external meeting. The Riverview Bistro overlooked the city's waterfront, its elegant interior a welcome respite from the January cold. Eleanor was already seated at a corner table when I arrived, looking even more polished than she had the previous evening in a burgundy dress with an architectural silver brooch. "Margaret," she greeted me warmly, rising slightly as I approached. "You have a certain glow about you today. Good news. I've resigned from Meridian," I replied as I took my seat, enjoying the declarative certainty of the statement. 2 weeks' notice, effective immediately. Eleanor's eyebrows rose. That's decisively quick. What prompted the certainty? Several things, I said, unfolding my napkin across my lap. I reviewed your materials until the early hours this morning. Second chapter isn't just a viable alternative. It's addressing a genuine market need with a clear vision. But more importantly, I realized I've been allowing others to define my value for too long. Whether or not we move forward together, I needed to reclaim my agency. A slow smile spread across Eleanor's face. That's exactly the spirit that built second chapter. Now, she continued as the waiter approached, shall we order first? Or would you prefer to dive straight into possibilities? Over roasted salmon and winter vegetables, we outlined what my role at second chapter might entail. Eleanor was refreshingly straightforward about expectations, challenges, and compensation. The base salary was indeed lower than my position at Meridian. $87,500 compared to my current $112,000, but the profit-sharing arrangement had significant upside potential if the company continued its current growth trajectory. I should mention, Eleanor said as she refilled our water glasses, that we have an informal policy I call transparent. Thursdays, once a month, we open the books completely to all staff, revenue, expenses, marketing ROI, everything. I believe people make better decisions when they understand the full business context. That's unusual in publishing, I noted. Most houses guard their numbers jealously, especially from editorial staff. Most houses also waste enormous energy on internal politics and information hoarding, Eleanor replied. I found transparency actually saves time and builds trust. Would that approach work for you? I considered the question seriously. I think it would be refreshing. I've always believed editors make better acquisition decisions when they understand the business realities. By the time we finished lunch, we had sketched the outlines of an agreement. I would join second chapter after a brief break between positions, starting as fiction acquisitions director with a 3-month mutual assessment period before committing to a longer-term arrangement. I would bring a select group of authors from my Meridian list, who fit second chapter's demographic and mission, and would have significant input into marketing and positioning strategies for my titles. I'll have our attorney draft an offer letter, Eleanor said as we prepared to leave. But I should warn you about something, Margaret. What's that? I asked, suddenly wary. Her expression softened. Freedom is addictive. Once you start reclaiming your value in one area of life, you may find it impossible not to do so in others. She squeezed my hand briefly. Just be prepared for the ripple effects. I thought about her words during my taxi ride back to Meridian, where I spent the afternoon informing my team of my departure. Their reactions ranged from shock to tearful dismay, with several expressing frustration that Meridian hadn't fought harder to keep me. Julie, my assistant for the past 4 years, pulled me aside after the team meeting. I know this is presumptuous, she said hesitantly, but would your new position possibly have room for an assistant? I've learned so much from you, and I'd really like to continue that education. Her request touched me deeply. Let me speak with Eleanor about it. I can't make promises yet, but I'll certainly advocate for you. By the time I left the office that evening, word of my resignation had already spread throughout the company. 3 senior editors from other divisions had stopped by my office to express their support and quietly inquire about second chapter, suggesting Eleanor had been right about the ripple effects of challenging established narratives. At home, I poured myself a glass of wine and finally addressed Thomas's text about Emma's camp deposit. Instead of my usual immediate agreement, I wrote, Thomas, I need to discuss something with you and Jennifer. Are you free for dinner at my house this Sunday at 6? His response came quickly, surprise at my indirect answer, but confirmation they would come. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of activity. By day, I methodically transitioned my Meridian responsibilities, meeting with authors to explain my departure and, in select cases, quietly discussing the possibility of following me to second chapter. By evening, I prepared for my new role, developing acquisition strategies and author outreach plans. I also began making subtle but meaningful changes at home. I hired a professional organizer to help transform my home office from a cramped afterthought to a proper workspace. I replaced the sagging mattress I'd been meaning to update for years. I scheduled the haircut I'd been postponing and bought 2 new professional outfits that made me feel confident rather than invisible. Sunday evening arrived with a nervous energy I hadn't anticipated. I prepared a simple but elegant meal, roasted chicken with herbs, winter vegetables, and fresh bread from the local bakery. I set the dining room table with my good dishes, adding a small centerpiece of white tulips and eucalyptus. This wasn't just dinner. It was the beginning of renegotiating my relationship with my son and daughter-in-law. Thomas and Jennifer arrived precisely at 6. The children left with Jennifer's parents, who were visiting for the weekend. I greeted them warmly, but with a new awareness of my posture and presence, consciously occupying space in a way I hadn't before. "The house looks different," Thomas remarked as he handed me a bottle of wine. "Did you change something?" "Several things, actually," I replied, leading them to the living room where I'd offered drinks before dinner. "I've been doing some updating." Jennifer glanced around with mild interest. "It looks nice, more modern." Her tone carried the faint surprise that I might actually have contemporary taste, despite my age. Over drinks I shared my news about leaving Meridian for second chapter press. Thomas seemed genuinely impressed, while Jennifer's reaction was more measured, starting over at a new company at she caught herself, just as Thomas had at New Year's. "I mean, making such a big change must be challenging." "It's actually incredibly energizing," I replied, maintaining eye contact until she glanced away first. "Eleanor has built something remarkable, and I'm excited to be part of it." As we moved to the dining table, I steered the conversation toward the real purpose of the evening. "Thomas, you asked about Emma's camp deposit," I began, serving the food with deliberate movements. "I've been thinking about our financial arrangements." Thomas and Jennifer exchanged quick glances. "Is something wrong, Mom?" Thomas asked. "Is money tight with the job change?" "Not at all," I responded calmly. "My financial situation is stable. But I've realized I need to establish clearer boundaries around financial support." Jennifer's posture stiffened slightly. "What does that mean exactly?" I took a sip of water, gathering my thoughts. "It means I'm happy to contribute to special occasions and genuine emergencies, but I won't be providing regular financial assistance while you're making discretionary purchases like country club memberships." The silence that followed was profound. Thomas's fork froze midway to his mouth, while Jennifer's cheeks flushed pink. "Mom, the country club is an investment in my career," Thomas finally said, his tone defensive. "The connections I make there will benefit our whole family. I understand that's your priority," I acknowledged. "And you're entitled to make that choice. But it doesn't obligate me to subsidize other expenses to facilitate it." Jennifer set down her fork with a controlled movement. "I'm not sure what's brought this on, Margaret, but it feels very sudden and frankly, hurtful. We've always considered ourselves one family unit, supporting each other." I met her gaze steadily. "One family unit? Like immediate family?" Her expression flickered with recognition before she quickly composed herself. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do," I said quietly. New Year's Eve was clarifying in many ways. It helped me recognize patterns I've been accepting for too long, being included when convenient and sidelined when not. Whether in photographs or financial planning. Thomas looked genuinely confused. "Mom, what are you talking about? What happened at New Year's?" The fact that he hadn't even noticed the photo incident was its own kind of revelation. "Ask Jennifer," I suggested. "She might remember suggesting that just the immediate family be in certain photos." Jennifer's flush deepened. "That was nothing personal. We just wanted some pictures with." "I understand," I interrupted gently. And this isn't personal either. I'm simply clarifying my boundaries going forward. I love you both, and Emma and Noah mean the world to me. But our relationship needs to be based on genuine connection, not financial convenience. The remainder of dinner progressed with strained conversation, Thomas attempting to mediate the newly exposed tension, while Jennifer maintained a cool politeness. When they left shortly after dessert, Thomas hugged me with what felt like genuine concern. "Are you really okay, Mom?" he asked quietly at the door. "You seem different." I smiled, touching his cheek affectionately. "I'm better than I've been in years. We'll find our way to a new normal, Thomas. It might just take some adjustment." After they left, I cleared the dishes with a strange mixture of emotions, regret at the discomfort, but also a profound sense of liberation. Eleanor had been right about the ripple effects. Once I had reclaimed my professional value, it became impossible not to extend that reclamation to my personal relationships as well. That night, I wrote in my journal for the first time in decades, documenting the beginning of what felt like a watershed moment in my life. As I closed the leather-bound book and prepared for bed, my phone buzzed with a text from an unexpected source. "Rachel, my daughter in Seattle. Thomas just called me, completely confused about why you're suddenly acting weird. What happened? Are you finally standing up to them? If so, I want details." I laughed out loud in my quiet house, typing back, "Long story, very long. Let's FaceTime tomorrow evening. Bring wine." Rachel's response was immediate. "It's a date, and Mom, whatever you did that has Jennifer's knickers in a twist. I'm already proud of you." I set my phone on the nightstand, feeling the warmth of my daughter's support. Tomorrow would bring my final week at Meridian and preparations for my new role at Second Chapter. It would also bring consequences from my conversation with Thomas and Jennifer, likely including further negotiations and potential conflict. But for now, in this moment, I was exactly where I needed to be, standing firmly at the center of my own story rather than hovering at its margins. 6 months after my dinner confrontation with Thomas and Jennifer, I stood in the elegant event space of Paragon Books, the city's premier independent bookstore, watching a crowd gather for Second Chapter's summer launch party. Golden evening light streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the display of new releases arranged on tables throughout the room. My heart swelled with particular pride at the centerpiece, The Invisible Season by Marianne Chen, a 63-year-old debut novelist whose manuscript I had discovered in my 3rd week at Second Chapter. "Quite a turnout," Eleanor remarked, appearing beside me with 2 glasses of champagne. She handed me one, her red reading glasses perched atop her silver hair. "The Chen novel pre-orders exceeded projections by 42%. Your instincts were right again." I smiled, accepting the glass. Marianne's voice deserved to be heard. "I'm just grateful we could provide the platform." I surveyed the room, literary critics mingling with local authors, booksellers, engaged in animated conversations with readers who had become loyal Second Chapter fans. In the corner, Julie, who had indeed followed me from Meridian and was now thriving as our editorial coordinator, was charming, a reporter from Publishers Weekly. "Speech time in 5 minutes," Eleanor reminded me, squeezing my arm before moving to greet new arrivals. I took a deep breath, touching the small note cards in my blazer pocket. Tonight I would be introducing Marianne and officially announcing Second Chapter's expanded fiction line, an initiative I had spearheaded that had already attracted significant industry attention. My phone buzzed with a text, and I glanced down to see a message from Rachel. "Knock 'em dead, Mom. Wish I could be there. Get someone to record your speech." Rachel had become my most enthusiastic cheerleader during this transformation. Our weekly FaceTime calls filled with updates on my professional renaissance and her insightful perspectives on the shifting family dynamics. She was planning to visit next month with her wife, their first trip east in over a year. My relationship with Thomas and Jennifer had entered a new phase following our dinner confrontation, not always comfortable, but increasingly authentic. The immediate aftermath had been tense. Jennifer had maintained a cool distance, while Thomas had vacillated between confusion and defensive retreat. I had maintained my position firmly but without hostility, remaining warm and available to my grandchildren while holding the boundaries I had established. The turning point had come, surprisingly, through Emma. My 9-year-old granddaughter had been assigned a school project on family careers and had begged to interview me about publishing. Jennifer had reluctantly arranged for Emma to spend an afternoon at Second Chapter 3 months ago, clearly expecting her daughter to be bored by her grandmother's work. Instead, Emma had been captivated. The bright, creative office space, with its wall of author photographs, the animated editorial meeting she had witnessed, the proof pages and cover designs spread across my desk, all of it had fascinated her. When Jennifer arrived to pick her up, Emma had proudly announced, "Grandma's the boss here. She finds the books and makes them better, and everyone listens to her ideas." Jennifer's expression had been a complex mixture of surprise and reevaluation as she looked around the thriving office, so different from the dusty, traditional environment she had clearly imagined. "Your office is ... not what I expected," she had admitted. "It's actually really impressive." That afternoon had marked a subtle shift in our dynamic. Jennifer began to see me not as an aging mother-in-law seeking relevance, but as a successful professional with expertise and influence. She had even called the following week to ask my advice about a work presentation she was preparing, a small but significant acknowledgement of my value beyond family obligation. Thomas had required a more direct conversation. After several weeks of awkward interactions following our boundary-setting dinner, I had invited him for lunch, just the two of us. "I feel like I don't understand what's happening," he had confessed over sandwiches at a quiet cafe. "You're different, Mom. It's like you suddenly decided we were taking advantage of you." "Not suddenly," I had corrected gently. "I've been allowing certain patterns for years because I thought that's what a good mother should do, always be available, never set conditions, provide support without question. But I've realized that's not healthy for any of us." "But we're family," he had insisted, echoing Jennifer's dinner argument. "Yes, we are," I'd agreed. "And in healthy families, all members are valued for who they are, not just what they provide." I felt that shift happening. Thomas becoming valuable to you and Jennifer primarily for babysitting and financial assistance rather than for myself. His face had flushed with the discomfort of recognition. "That wasn't intentional, I know," I'd assured him. "But it was happening all the same." The New Year's photo was just a visible symbol of a larger pattern. That conversation had opened a door to a more honest relationship. Thomas had begun calling occasionally just to check in. Not only when he needed something, he had made more effort to bring the children for visits without Jennifer's prompting. And when he and Jennifer had ultimately decided against the country club membership, reallocating those funds to a college savings plan for the children instead, I had supported the decision wholeheartedly and contributed a matching amount to demonstrate that my boundaries weren't about withholding, but about intentionality. 2 minutes, Margaret, Eleanor called, breaking into my reflections. I nodded acknowledgement, taking a final moment to gather my thoughts before the presentation. As I stepped toward the small podium, I caught sight of an unexpected figure entering at the back of the room. Thomas. He hadn't mentioned attending tonight, and seeing him there, dressed in a suit directly from his office, clearly making an effort to be present for this milestone, filled me with a complicated joy. "Good evening, everyone," I began, my voice steady and confident. "Welcome to Second Chapter's summer celebration. 6 months ago, I joined this remarkable company with a simple but powerful belief that experience creates depth, that wisdom accrues with living, and that voices which have weathered time's passage have unique and vital stories to tell." As I continued my prepared remarks, introducing our upcoming titles and celebrating our recent successes, I maintained eye contact with various sections of the audience. When I looked toward Thomas, he offered an encouraging smile, small but genuine. "And now, It is my great pleasure to introduce the author whose extraordinary debut novel has already received advance praise from the New York Times as a revelation of hard-won wisdom and unflinching truth. Please welcome Marianne Chen, author of The Invisible Season. Applause filled the room as Marianne approached the podium. At 63, she embodied the second chapter ethos, a woman who had spent decades absorbing experiences and observations before transforming them into art that could only have been created through the alchemy of time and reflection. After the formal presentations concluded, I circulated through the crowd, engaging with booksellers and reviewers, introducing authors to potential champions of their work. Thomas waited patiently, and when I finally made my way to him, he enveloped me in a warm hug. "That was amazing, Mom," he said, genuine admiration in his voice. "The way you spoke about those books, it's obvious how much you love what you're doing here." "I do," I acknowledged. "It feels like the work I was always meant to do, even though I couldn't have imagined it a year ago." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "Life's funny that way, isn't it? The unexpected turns sometimes lead to the best destinations." I introduced him to several colleagues, including Eleanor, who sized him up with her characteristic directness before declaring, "I see the resemblance around the eyes. You have your mother's perceptive gaze." Thomas seemed pleased by the observation. As the event began winding down, he helped the staff gather empty glasses and rearrange furniture, small actions that once would have been unthinkable for him. "Jennifer wanted to come," he mentioned as we prepared to leave, "but Noah has a slight fever." She sent her congratulations though. The fact that Jennifer had even considered attending represented significant progress. "Please thank her for me, and I hope Noah feels better soon." "Actually," Thomas said, with slight hesitation, "we were wondering if you'd like to come over for dinner this Sunday. Emma's been asking to show you her writing project. Apparently you've inspired a future editor." I smiled at the thought. I'd like that very much. Outside the bookstore, the summer evening was still bright, the air warm and fragrant with blooming lindens. Thomas walked me to my car, pausing before we parted. "You know, Mom, I've been thinking about something you said during our lunch conversation months ago, about being valued for who you are, not just what you provide." I nodded, remembering the difficult but necessary exchange. "I didn't really understand then," he continued, "but I think I'm starting to. Watching you tonight, seeing how everyone respected your opinion, how passionate you are about these authors, I realized I've been missing so much of who you actually are." He looked slightly embarrassed. "I got so caught up in my own life that I started seeing you as, I don't know, just Mom, not Margaret Sullivan, the editor who champions overlooked voices." His recognition touched me deeply. We all do that sometimes, reduce people to the roles they play in our lives, rather than seeing their full humanity. "Well, I'm trying to do better," he said simply. "And I want Emma and Noah to really know their grandmother, not just as the person who helps when needed, but as the accomplished, interesting woman you are." As I drove home that night, I reflected on the extraordinary journey of the past 6 months, the painful exclusion at New Year's that had crystallized my growing sense of erasure, the professional dismissal that had seemed like a devastating blow but had actually opened the door to a more aligned path, the difficult but necessary recalibration of family dynamics. Eleanor had been right. Freedom was indeed addictive. Each step of reclaiming my value had led to another, creating a cascade of transformations that had fundamentally altered how I existed in the world, and how others perceived me. At home, I kicked off my heels and poured a small glass of bourbon to celebrate the successful event. On my coffee table lay a stack of reader letters that had arrived that week, correspondence from women and some men, who had found their experiences reflected in second chapters books. I picked up the top envelope, already open, and reread the handwritten note inside. "Dear Ms. Sullivan, I am writing to thank you for publishing The Late Bloomer's Garden, finding a novel with a protagonist who is 68, vibrant, and embarking on new adventures. Rather than fading into the background was like discovering water in a desert. For the first time in years, I felt seen. Please tell your authors to keep writing stories for those of us who know that life doesn't end at 50, in many ways. That's when it gets most interesting. With gratitude, Eleanor Jameson, age 72. I traced my fingers over Eleanor's handwritten words, feeling the connection between her gratitude and my own sense of purpose. 6 months ago, I had been pushed to the margins of a photo, deemed not immediate family, my professional expertise dismissed as outdated. Now I stood firmly at the center of a life, rebuilt on my own terms, not despite my age and experience, but because of the depth and wisdom they provided. My phone chimed with an email notification. It was from Marianne, sent just minutes ago. Margaret, tonight was magical. I still can't quite believe that at 63, I'm a debut author with a book being celebrated by people who see its value. When every other publisher rejected my manuscript because stories about women past 50 don't sell. You not only acquired it but championed it with such conviction. You've changed my life, and I will forever be grateful that you saw what others couldn't. That some stories can only be told after they've been fully lived. With immense appreciation, Marianne. I smiled, saving the email to a special folder where I kept meaningful correspondence. Then I opened my laptop and began working on an acquisition memo for a promising manuscript that had arrived that morning, a novel by a 70-year-old former architect about a woman who reinvents herself after retirement. The clock read nearly midnight, but I felt energized rather than tired. This wasn't just work, it was purpose. This wasn't just a job, it was a mission. And I was exactly where I belonged, visible, valued, and vital, creating space for others whose stories deserved to be not just told, but celebrated. The woman who had stood silently at the margins of a family photo 6 months ago was gone, transformed not by becoming someone new, but by finally refusing to be less than who she truly was. No longer cropped out of her own life, she had reframed the entire picture, and in doing so, had created an image far more beautiful and authentic than she could have imagined.